Welcome to what should be the second class period for beginning fencing for UNCW. My name's Greg Spar, and this will be part of the series that will be for being either a totally online or a hybrid type course. And what will happen, this particular video will probably be the entire class for today. What will happen down the road is that I will show you some moves and get you started. There will probably be some other outside videos that help with the training and the exercise parts of the course. And then additionally, maybe some other videos that reinforce the moves that we've been working on. So you may have 2 or 3 different videos that you'll need to take a look at for subsequent classes. This is a good time for you to get involved with fencing. Obviously nobody knows what's going to happen post-pandemic, but what was happening was that fencing was one of the fastest growing sports in the country. It was the number 1 fastest growing sport for high school boys and number 2 for high school women. Probably the numbers of fencers had something like probably quadrupled or quintupled since about the year 2000. And the United States was becoming more and more of a fencing power throughout the world. Now, of course, unfortunately, for 2020, the Olympics and all the world championship type tournaments have been canceled. So we'll have to wait and see in 2021 how everything is happening. Fencing is not nearly as dangerous as people seem to believe. It was part of an NCAA survey in the early 2000s where they surveyed all of the injuries from all of the various sports. And the sport that came in closest to fencing and the number of injuries it produced was golf. In about 2015 or so, the Olympics did a study of all of their sports, split them into summer and winter, and fencing's in the Summer Olympics, and then ranked them of how dangerous they were, how many injuries they produced through practicing and actual competitions. And fencing was the 6th from the bottom for the Summer Olympic sports. The 5 below it were diving, synchronized swimming, kayaking, rowing, and sailing. So according to the Olympics, fencing is much safer than basketball, baseball, softball, track and field, wrestling, swimming, badminton, table tennis, archery, just about every other sport that you can mention. And the number 1 sport for producing injuries in the Summer Olympics is soccer. So every time that a high school athletic director tells you, oh, we can't have fencing, it's too dangerous, just ask if they have soccer. So, when did sword fighting actually start? The first drawings of sword fights and the first swords that we have come from the Egyptians. And they have found swords in Egyptian tombs. The Egyptian sword is called a khopesh. And it's basically, it looks like a sickle. And that's really what they did, is they took a sickle they've been using to cut grain, and they sharpened both sides of it, and now it was a sword. The swords that they found, like I say, were made out of 2 metals. The first is bronze, which is a combination of copper and tin. And the second was gold. And if you know anything about gold, it's actually a very soft metal. So it wouldn't have held an edge, wouldn't have held up very well to battle, so they're pretty sure the gold swords are decorative. When we have swords, there are two basic ways in which we can hurt somebody else. We call them thrusting and cutting, or as some people say, stabbing and slashing. If you want to build a sword that's really good for stabbing, what you need is a sharp point and a thin blade. Much harder to push a thick blade into another human being. If you want a more cutting sword, now you need sharp edges and a thicker blade to make sure that the cut will go through the person. One of the things that you will find out is that contrary to what you see done in Hollywood movies, stabbing is actually much more deadly than cutting. The other thing that you can probably already figure out is that there is no perfect sword. Every sword maker, when they start to make a sword, has to decide how much cutting power they want versus how much stabbing power. And it's a compromise, and that's the way they build a sword to give them the attributes that they want out of it. So, what's the best sword in the world? The answer is not Excalibur. Generally, some people disagree. The katana is considered to be about the best sword in the world. A number of reasons for this. First, the Japanese are very, very diligent in how they make their swords. It's considered an art form in Japan. So they're very careful and put a lot of love into making their swords. The other things are, as you see, the blade is slightly curved. That helps because you then actually have more edge for the actual length of the blade. And this slight curve also helps in that once you've cut someone, it's easier to pull the sword out of them than if you had a straight sword. Another thing that makes this a good sword is, if you look at a European style sword, it's what we call double edge. It cuts on both sides. So you can cut this way, and you could cut back that way. To be able to do that, you have to make the blade a little bit thicker and wider. What the Japanese did is they made a single-edged sword. And you can see the back side of the sword is thicker. So, you have to be able to turn your hand when you change to cut. But, because it's reinforced back here, it has more cutting power, and you can make the sword thinner, which gives it a better chance with stabbing. Going back to history, the Egyptians were 2000, 2400 BC, and then on up against the Bronze Age. Then about the year 900 BC, a bunch of guys called the Hittites who lived in Turkey and Syria made this really cool discovery called iron. And if you have iron and you have some form of carbon, then you can make steel. And the Hittites came out of the hills with their iron and steel swords and laid waste to just about everybody. It starts an arms race. So you have this tribe over here that's making better swords. The other tribes either have to figure out that technology to make better swords as well, or they can go to making better armor. And so once they make better armor, these people have to make better swords to be able to get through the armor. They have to make even better armor, and we have an arms race. So it goes pretty much like that until we get to the Romans. And the Romans have one of the first swords that really gets its own name and becomes very famous. It's the Roman infantry short sword. You can see it's got maybe about an 18-inch blade. It's a fairly wide blade that does come to a pretty good point. And it would be used behind the shield. You know, the Romans advanced with a shield wall. So somebody would get an opening to try to hit somebody, you pop it open, you stab, you protect yourself again. Or you might go over the top and stab over your shield. This one could cut some, could stab, probably used more as a stabbing type weapon. You see it's fairly short. The metallurgy of the time, there were some longer swords that the Romans had, but they didn't hold up as well because of the way the metals were still being made. This sword is called a gladius. And of course, another thing of people who use gladiuses a lot became known as gladiators. And that's how they got their name. Rome falls, we go into the Dark Ages. One of the things that happens in the Dark Ages is that making swords improves. So by the time we get to the Vikings, a sword is about maybe 2.5 foot of blade with a handle. And you see the blade is not as thick as the gladius had to be. It holds an edge better. It's probably a little more flexible, a little more durable, and it would survive longer without having to be like remade. And then by the time we get to 1100, we're up to where swords hit the length for a one-handed sword, they pretty much stay. So you've got about a 35, 36-inch blade, and then a handle down here. And this would be a double-edged, one-handed broadsword that, like a knight or someone, of that sort of class would use. Then in about 1295 AD, there's a gentleman in Scotland who has made or makes one of the first very large two-handed swords. For you guys, this is probably an old movie. It's called Braveheart. A good movie, historically not very, very accurate. This is the sword that was used in the movie. You can see, say, two-handed sword. This sword is about 4 foot, 4 inches tall. Now, one of the historical inaccuracies in the movie is that Sir William Wallace was played by Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson's about my height, about 5'8", 5'9". The actual Sir William Wallace was 6'7". And this was in a time when the average person was more like 5'4", something like that. So when he comes in the movie and says, oh, they say Sir William Wallace is a giant. Sir William Wallace was a giant compared to everybody else back then. Now, again, this is not what the Sir William Wallace sword actually looks like. The sword that's believed to belong to Sir William Wallace, I'm not 100% sure, but they've tested the metal, it's the right time period, except for some reparations done to it. And supposedly was taken from him when he was captured, is in British Museum. And one of the things about that sword is it's actually 5 foot 4 inches tall. So it's about this big, it's about another foot on top of this sword. So what would you have in a fight where there are actually legends? Sir William Wallace, would be 6'7" and have a sword about this big. The average person would be about the size of Sir William Wallace's sword and only have a sword this long. Not a fair fight. But Hollywood doesn't make movies about really, really big guys going around beating the crap out of a bunch of little people and make that person the hero. And there are all sorts of legends that Sir William Wallace would take his sword, wade into a set of opponents, and would be lopping off 4 or 5 heads every time he would swing his sword. So, with swords getting so much bigger, what do people have to do? They have to make better shields and armor. By the time you get to about 1550, a suit of armor is inch-thick plate steel and weighs about 200 pounds. Now, when knights put on this armor, first off, knights were the wealthy class of people. That armor was not cheap. The swords were not cheap. So if you had a suit of armor and you were a knight, you were very well off. When two knights had an argument, they had a duel. The duel back then for two knights was a joust. The main weapon in a joust is a lance. And so swords were very much secondary weapons, along with like battle axes and maces and morning stars and all of those kind of sidearm type weapons. And the knights would really only use those when they ran out of lances. So the sword was not as important as being able to use a lance very well. What happened is that occasionally, of course, these knights did not fight duels with just each other. They had to fight in battles as part of an army that the king would raise for a certain war against somebody else. And all of the peasants also got pulled into the battles. Now, if you were a peasant, you showed up, you maybe had a burlap bag for clothing. If you were a really well-off peasant, maybe you had shoes. If you had worked in the kitchen, maybe you stole a couple of knives. If you worked in the stables, maybe you brought the pitchfork that you used. You didn't have really good weapons. And then one morning, you're out on the battlefield, you're the peasants, you're probably in the front line, and you look across the field and there are 150 of these knights on their beautiful, huge horses. And the horse they used back then is a breed that doesn't exist anymore called the Destrier. And its closest living relatives are the Budweiser Clydesdales. So these were huge horses, and they were in armor. And the knight had his beautiful armor, and they're getting ready to attack you, and you are probably thinking, how fast can I get out of here? They did come up with different ways to try to deal with that. One of the ways was like with pole axes and long spears that they would raise up at the last minute when the knights were charging. Another way that they did it was they would wait till the knights started to get close. They'd try to jump out of the way so that the knights would pass through their lines. And then when the knights turned around to try to maybe come back and charge the other way, while the horse was slowed down, they'd get a lot of people around it, try to grab the knight, try to pull him off the horse. When they did that, if they could get the knight off the horse, here's this about 5'6", 5'8" size person by that point, with 200 pounds of armor on the ground. Now, knights back then wore 3 layers of protection. They had their plate armor. Under the plate armor, you have chainmail, little rings that are interwoven to provide extra protection. And underneath the chainmail, you generally wore heavy leather. You did not want to be riding around on a horse all day, chafing your skin up against that chainmail. The plate armor could not go over 100% of your body. You know, first you needed little slits and things for your eyes so that you could see what was going on. But also, you had to leave some flexibility and some places around different joints so that you could actually move while you were fighting. Some joints, the single motion type joints like your elbow, your knee, pretty easy to also protect. You have a cutout here so that you could move, but you could then put extra armor that would still protect you over the top of that. However, your shoulder is so complex that you couldn't put extra armor under there because it would limit you, and you need a lot of different motion to be able to ride with the reins and use your weapons and everything that you would be doing during the battle. So, what the knights, were doing these attacks, and what the army guys came up with to try to fight against that was once they got a knight off of his horse onto the ground, someone would, they try to keep him down, someone would grab an arm, jump the left arm, and someone invented the very long, very thin, would have been very sharp sword at this end that was small enough to go in between the rings of the chainmail, and they would stab, stir slightly, and then you would have one fewer knife that you have to worry about. So, within about 50 years, there are no more knights on battlefields. But it's actually not because of this and the other tactics that the army guys had. That 1550s date is also the time when you had guns starting to be miniaturized from cannons into rifles and even to some pistols. So you had people now on these very large, slow horses, and they were finding out that their inch-thick plate armor did not stop bullets. So what the knights have to do, they dump the really big, slow horses, they dump the big, heavy armor, they went to smaller, faster horses, and maybe just like a breastplate and a bit of a helmet. And now they were using their speed because people hadn't quite figured out the moving target thing yet. They were using that speed of their horses to keep them better protected than what their armor used to protect them. That leaves the knight and the gentry classes with a problem. The problem they now have is, what do we do if we have to fight a duel with each other? We don't have the horses, we don't have the armor, we can't do jousting anymore. So they switched to using a weapon called a rapier and started going to sword fights. The rapier is a stabbing weapon. It is very sharp at the point, and you see it has a longer, thinner blade to hit someone like that. What that leads to is what we have now in modern fencing. We have 3 different types of weapons that come from 3 different countries for 3 different kinds of duels. This is a foil. This is the weapon that we'll be teaching primarily in this class. And it was actually the practice weapon for a duel with a rapier. It comes out of France. In France, if you were a nobleman and you got into an argument with another nobleman, you had to have a duel to the death. You intended to kill your opponent. And if you've seen Three Musketeers movies, that opening sort of scene where D'Artagnan meets all the other Musketeers and arranges duels with them, and they all show up for the first duel. He's arranged a duel with each of the Three Musketeers, and then the Musketeers start arguing because they're saying, wait a minute, he insulted me, and I have to kill him later today, so you can't kill him now. Because how will I get my honor back if you kill him? And while they're arguing, the Cardinal's guards show up and say, the king is outlawed dueling. And that actually happened in France. So many noblemen were killing each other that the king made duels illegal. And of course, being French, they totally ignored it and kept going. So, duel to the death. What do you want to do? You obviously want to kill the other person as quickly as possible. What's the best way to do that? It's to hit them in a vital organ. So, when you're trying to use this weapon, you're going to try to hit them in the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the colon, pancreas, liver, spleen, kidneys, something where you can kill them very quickly because you're still in danger if they don't die quickly. You might be able to nick an artery in the leg or the neck, but while you're trying to do that, very likely your opponent's running their sword through your chest. Therefore, what we have in the modern foil for the target is basically the torso. You've got a little bit of the neck, but basically where the organs are. So no arms, no legs. In the front of your body, it will go down to your crotch. In the back, it'll only go down to, the target will only go down to about your waist, because it's very hard to kill someone by hitting them in the butt this way. The other thing is, when you're in a duel to the death, what's the most important thing? Don't die. So the rules and the techniques of this sword are built so that you will survive the duel. To that end, we have what we call right of way, meaning that when you are fencing, if someone attacks you, you have to stop that attack before you try to hit them back. There are newspaper reports from 1600s to early 1900s of people who didn't know how to fence, getting into a duel. They would maybe do the back-to-back, do 10 paces thing, turn, and then they would extend their arms and run at each other, and run each other through and both fall over dead. So, you have right of way, and you protect yourself when you've been attacked. Advantage goes to the person who attacks first, because now the other person has to protect himself. What that leads to is that only one person can score at a time. And this right-of-way also makes foil a weapon where, by using the rules, that you can, okay, let's pause it there.